Hey everybody, my name is Dylan Weisman. We'll be joined shortly by Chris Wehner, and together we make your new Upswing Poker Pot Limit Omaha coaching staff. Today, Chris is going to be reviewing a hand that he played at 2550 on WSOP.com. The hand itself is absolutely awesome, and I'm highly excited for everyone to get the information Chris has to give. It will help you become a better Pot Limit Omaha player, and that is our goal. Before we hop into the action, I want to make this the official announcement video for the Advanced PLO Mastery course that's being created by both Chris and myself. This course is one of a kind and has brand new information. To show you how awesome that information is, the video that you're seeing today is actually a sneak peek from the course, so please enjoy it.
Thanks for the introduction, Dylan. I'm Chris Wehner, and I'm also excited for everyone to see this upcoming content. Now getting into the hand, this hand was played at 2550 PLO against a very tough, intelligent, and rather aggressive opponent, MJ Perry. So we go ahead and open the button with 9988 single suited, and the villain defends. We flop really well, flopping middle set, and the villain checks to us, where we c-bet 2/3 pot. In single raise pots like this, we want to simplify our strategy down to betting a single size based on the dynamism of the board. So the more dynamic the board, the larger we want to bet, and the less dynamic or the more static the board, the smaller we want to bet. Here, ace-8-6 two-tone is a rather dynamic board, and the appropriate bet size is 2/3 pot. So we want to be betting about half of our range when check to here, and some of those bets are very obvious. Hands like this that are very near the top of our range are going to be really high frequency bets regardless of their side cards. But when we get more into the middle of our range, there's going to be a lot more mixing going on. If we look at some of our top pair combos or middle pair combos, some of our straight draws and flush draws, some of those hands are going to be mixing bet and mixing check. I think one good way to think about dictating our frequencies here is betting the ones that have more board interaction and checking the ones that have less board interaction. So if we have a hand like top pair or middle pair that has a spade, that's going to lean way more towards betting, and those same hand classes without a spade are going to lean way more towards checking. Same thing with those hand classes having a 7. If they have a 7 that blocks a lot more straights, those are going to lean towards betting. Without a 7, those might lean more towards checking. Because having that extra spade or that straight blocker is really going to generate a little bit more fold equity that makes those bets that much more profitable. Thinking about our flop strategy in this way, that being betting some of those more middling hands much more often if they have a spade blocker or a 7 blocker and checking them much more often without, is an example of a heuristic. Heuristics are very useful in poker, especially in PLO because of the size of the game and its complexity. In the fundamentals section of this course, I go over endless numbers of heuristics so that you have easy executable strategies that simplify stuff that would otherwise be way too complex for us to play well. That said, this hand is so near the top of our range here that it's going to be a very high frequency flop bet, so bet we do, and our opponent calls. The turn is the king of spades and our opponent checks to us. When we run this spot through a solver, we see that we can play a strategy of betting either full pot or checking without losing any meaningful game value. When we're playing that strategy, one hand class that will definitely bet a lot is going to be the nut flush. The ones that will check are going to be the ones that block 2 pair or better, and the ones that have 3 spades or more, because those hands are going to generate more value in the check line. If we had the second nut flush here, it's going to work similarly to the nut flush in that we'll be betting it a lot more often whenever we unblock the board pairs because we can generate a lot more value with it, whereas we'll be checking it a lot more if we block board pairs. One way the second nut flush operates differently from the nut flush here is that if we have the second nut flush with a 3rd or even a 4th spade, we want to bet it actually a lot more often than not, because that's going to decrease the number of nut flushes in our opponent's range while keeping the number of his nut flush blockers intact, which means that if he raises, he'll be disproportionately weighted towards the nut flush blocker, which makes that a great bluff catching candidate. Beyond the nut and the second nut flush here, most of our other flushes want to be checking back the turn. Our remaining turn value bets want to be centered around hands that have robust equity. When I say hands with robust equity, I mean hands that can maintain their equity and their ability to make the effective nuts across the turn and the river. Sets are prime candidates for this. Our stronger sets here, like pocket aces and pocket kings, are going to be pretty high frequency bets, and when we get down into hands like pocket eights, they're going to mix a bit more. They need to generate a little additional fold equity to bet, so they're going to mix more towards betting whenever they have a spade and checking without. Beyond that, all of our weaker made hands are going to be checking, and then we can look at what some of our bluffs are going to be on the turn here. So the obvious bluff is the nut flush blocker, and we're going to use that selectively. We're going to bet it generally when we have less than 2 pair, and we're going to be checking our nut flush blockers when we have 2 pair or better because they have adequate showdown value. Beyond that, and I think this is the area where people are probably playing too passively, is where the rest of our bluffs come from. If we have any 4 cards here that are unpaired, they don't block an ace, they don't block an 8, a 6, or a king, and they have a single spade in them, they're going to be quite high frequency bets. The exceptions are hands that have maybe a 7 or a 9 because they block those straight draws. But if we have 4 unpaired cards here that unblock a 7 especially, perhaps they have a gut shot, they picked up a Broadway gut shot on the turn, or they have a low gut shot from the flop, those are going to be almost pure bets if they have a single spade. So if we have a hand here like 5-4-3 deuce with a spade, or Jack-10 3 deuce with a spade, any of these combinations that have kind of a gut shot and a single spade are all going to be really high frequency bets, and I think that's an area where we can probably all add some aggression to our game because we're playing too passively. Thinking about how to find those additional turn bluffs here, those being a lot of hands that don't have a board pair or a straight draw blocker but do have a single spade, is another example of a heuristic like we talked about earlier. This is the type of heuristic that's going to be very common in this course. Heuristics where we can increase our aggression, where we were likely playing too passively. I think there are numerous opportunities for us to increase our win rate a lot in areas similar to this. So if you'd like to increase your aggression where you're probably playing too passively and leaving money on the table, make sure to check out the new course. When we polarize our range, we want to bet either full pot or check. So we do bet full pot here, and we face a check raise from our opponent. When we face a check raise from our opponent here, he's representing the nut flush, and I think this is a good time to ask ourselves if any of the actions in this hand have led him to be discounted in the number of nut flushes versus nut flush blocker combinations he can have here in his range. And I think the answer to that question is yes, one of those hand classes is going to be discounted in our opponent's range, because if we think back to the flop action, remember, we bet the flop, so we're going to have most or close to all of our nut flush combinations in our range, but our opponent check called the flop. Sure, he's going to check call some of his nut flush combinations, but the majority of his nut flush combinations are going to lean towards raising on the flop. When we run this spot through a solver, the solver confirms our expectation that our opponent should indeed be discounted in the number of nut flushes he has here compared to nut flush blockers he has here. He should have about 1.5 times as many nut flush blockers here as he does nut flushes. So this is a spot where our opponent has to be selective with which nut flush blockers he chooses to bluff with here, because if he check raises all of them on the turn and follows through with all of them on the river, he'll be bluffing much too often. As this hand is playing out here, we see why there's so much emphasis on betting hands in position here that have robust equity. We much prefer to be in a situation like this where we have a set where if we are behind, we have some outs to the effective nuts, compared to having a hand like a middling or a low flush that is a pure bluff catcher and cannot catch up on the river. Having outs to the effective nuts here means that we have a very clear continue versus this check raise, and continue we do. The river is a 7 of spades, and our opponent bets full pot. The 7 of spades may initially seem like a bad card for us here on the river because we were all just hoping to fill up to a full house and we failed to do so, but it's actually a good card in a number of ways because it doesn't change the number of nut flush blocker combinations in our opponent's range, but it does discount even further the number of nut flushes in his range. Understanding the number of possible bluffs compared to value bets that the villain can show up with here is an example of combinatoric awareness. It's important to be combinatorically aware because if we know how often villain can show up with various parts of his range, we can make more informed decisions. This is a central focus of the course. I'm going to teach you countless baselines like this to make you a better PLO player. While this river is quite good for those reasons mentioned, we still want to have some bluff catchers here that fold the river and some bluff catchers here that call the river. And when we look at a hand like a set, it's very near the bottom of our range at this point. So when we run this hand through a solver, basically all of our sets are pure folding the river here, and we're filling our calls with stronger hands like flushes. At this point, I'd like to take a moment to explain why studying theory is useful in 2 ways. First of all, it's useful in the classic, more traditional sense that we study game theory, we look at our own ranges, and we tweak our own ranges so that they're closer to optimal play. But it's also useful in a second sense, and that's a more exploitative sense. When we study these baselines and learn this theory, we're able to use them to make more informed decisions to exploit our opponent's tendencies. As mentioned at the beginning of this hand history, against an opponent like this who's very tough and also very aggressive, I think that it's possible to consider exploitative adjustments. When we look at the number of nut flushes versus nut flush blockers on the turn, as we've described, in combination with this additional spade blocker on the river here, and we have a set that is not a naked set, but actually a set with a spade, both of these cards further reduce the number of nut flushes he has while not affecting the number of nut flush blockers he has. So I think it's reasonable to consider a call here, which I do, and fortunately we run into one of those nut flush blocker combinations and scoop the nearly $16,000 pot. And lastly, let's look at our decision here to make an exploitative adjustment on the river. The hand that villain shows up with is ace queen 6-4 with the nut flush blocker, so he was bluff raising the turn with ace 6 for 2 pair. All of villain's ace 6 and ace 8 kind of combinations on the turn should be check calling with the nut flush blocker. He should be bluff raising with weaker nut flush blocker combinations. So it follows logically that if he's bluff raising with this nut flush blocker combination, he's probably bluff raising too often and is going to be weighted too heavily towards bluffs, which confirms that our adjustment to bluff catch wider than optimally is likely correct. Thanks for taking the time today to listen to my analysis of this hand, and be on the lookout for additional sneak peeks in the coming weeks and months of the Advanced PLO Mastery course.
Both Chris and myself are incredibly dedicated to making this the best Pot Limit Omaha course ever created. For that to be true, we actually need your help. Please go follow Upswing Poker on their social medias, both on Facebook and Twitter, and give us feedback. Let us know what you thought of Chris's evaluation of the hand, and if there's anything that you'd like to see more of in the upcoming months. With that being said, have a great day, everybody.